Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome wherever you are joining us online for Islamophobia National Survey Report. This is really is a report on Islamophobia in post 9/11 America. I'm Dr. Hatem Bazian, President of International Islamophobia Studies Research Association, an association that has almost 200 different academics, researchers connected to this network to study the phenomena of Islamophobia. Today, this program is organized by Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley and the Islamophobia Studies Center. Let me first really thank all of the organizations that have made this work possible. Islamophobia Research and Documentation Project at UC Berkeley, Center for Race and Gender, a partner organization on campus, CARE, Council on American Islamic Relations, Justice for Muslims Collectives, Muslim Advocates, and ISPU, Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. This is really an important time for us in examining the phenomena of Islamophobia and the variety of ways it shows itself. One is often there is a discussion and debate about the term Islamophobia. And the debate is, in my view, is already foregone. But if we want to date the term itself, it actually originates in the French context around 1910, describing and articulating the French treatment of Muslims in North Africa. And at that time, it just described as an inimical feelings toward Muslims. This term was picked up by Edward Said, who really one of the early trailblazers in examining stereotyping and representation of Muslims. And I think his trilogy is still one of the most important ways to engage the subject, covering Islam and early work on how the media and the representation frames the subject of Islam and Muslims. Orientalism is still a must-read in both in academic setting as well as in the broader setting, and it also was connected to the question of Palestine. So these are really the trilogy of Edward Said. Many have built upon it, and the field can really be looked upon as a major contribution to Edward Said and those that really came after him. In general, we often post 9/11, media pundits, individuals in academia, in policy circles, preoccupied themselves with trying to answer the dubious, racist, Islamophobic question of why they hate us. Never in their mind attempting to actually understand the ramification of policy, both domestic as well as international. We often have the framing of can the subaltern speak? And I think we could translate this, can the Muslim speaks? And if they speak as a class or a group, do we listen? And if we listen, do we actually attempt to change policy and take their statements and their perspectives into consideration? The challenge of Islamophobia is not only a debate about the term, imperfect that it is, it's about the implication. It's the ways that Muslims are often acted upon, marginalized, zones of inclusion and exclusion in relations to racial geography, uh, and all the various ways that Islamophobia manifests, whether it's verbal, employment, and for sure, violence. And I think as we speak about the survey report, we'll begin to identify some of the major findings as Muslims are telling us uh, of what they are facing on a daily basis in America. And this could be also made a point of comparison between the United States, France, Canada, and other locations around the globe. But really, it's a very, very important, groundbreaking work and survey that we begin to look at those who are impacted by Islamophobia. Having looked at much of the work on Islamophobia for quite some time, the focus was on media analysis, political actors, the Islamophobia industry, or on legitimate areas of examination. But today, and I think moving forward, is to begin to actually look at those who are impacted by Islamophobia as a group. This survey had 1,100 respondents, and I think it's a very, very critical piece of material that should be deployed in our classrooms, should be read by policymakers, should be led by leadership, Muslim leadership in the nonprofit organizations, as well as in the broader society. So I look forward for us to listen to the findings of this survey, and I would like to bring really two key figures that made this survey possible. First is my dear colleague, Sadiq Sheikh, is the director of the Global Justice Program at the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley. He has been a key contributor to many fields, but really has been a partner in the work on Islamophobia that we are undertaking. And I would recommend for people to read his full bio, because we want to give them the time to really speak about the survey. And Basima Sizmor is a researcher for the Global Justice Program at the Othering and Belonging Institute as well. Both have been co-participants and partners not only on this research, but also on other research in relations to Islamophobia. So welcome both, and really it's a pleasure to have you. So let's really get this going. Sadiq, why this research? What's the impetus behind it? Why only research Muslims, which is a small percentage of the American public? Why is this research needed from the Othering and Belonging Institute, and what was behind making this survey a reality?
Thank you so much, Professor Bazian, for generous introductions. And also, just before I start answering your question, I want to thank all the co-sponsor and our esteemed co-panelists. And also, I want to thank all those who work really hard behind the scene to support the making of this report and these events. In particular, I would like to thank our colleague, Marco Bezet, who making this events reality. So I remember when we said, Basim and I, back in almost 2 years ago, to design this survey, we struck with the lack of data that documents the voices of Muslim American concerning the impact of Islamophobia in their daily lives. So we never find a comprehensive kind of stock of how Muslims themselves feel about the phenomena. So, and when we conducted this study last year, we intentionally decided to survey only the US Muslim population in order to bring their voices and views about Islamophobia and its impact on their daily life. So we designed the survey to cover many areas such as US Muslims' perceptions, behavior, and attitudes concerning Islamophobia, and the US Muslims' worldview on many other social issues. But someone might ask why Islamophobia, as you suggested, and why surveying only US Muslim population? Beside what you stated, Hatim, why Islamophobia? Because we know that Islamophobia has a long history in the United States and did not emerge after 9/11. Also because we know that Islamophobia built on the backdrop of structural racism and racialization in US society. Also, we know that Islamophobia has been used as a political utility for demagogues and white supremacists. Because also we know that Islamophobia has been used to drive a national security narrative that justifies militarism, securitization, and imperial foreign policy. And also because we know that Islamophobia does not only impact US Muslims, but the US society as a whole. So for all this reason, we decided that we need to study Islamophobia as we've been doing, but we needed to create a data-driven a survey to allow us to look further on other issues related to Islamophobia. And thus will answer the question and why we have to conduct this survey with US Muslims only. Because in the US and in other parts of the world, it's common to study social phenomena without asking those who impacted the most with the issue. And Islamophobia is not an exception. Therefore, we wanted to hear directly from those who impacted mostly by Islamophobia. So we designed our survey to ask Muslims about their perception about Islamophobia. And if it does exist, then we wanted to know how big is it, and the social, psychological, and legal impacts of Islamophobia on their attitudes, behavior, and their struggle as they navigate their daily lives in society. On the other hand, we also wanted it to provide a window for the general public and a scholar, an activist, and organizer into the US Muslims' diverse background, their point of view in civic engagement, their views in racial equity, immigration, intercultural interaction, mainstream media, and above all, we wanted it to deploy their resilience to belong in the US society. So that's kind of what is the guiding principle, what led us to conduct the survey.
Thank you. Just remind our audience, please, if you have any questions, make sure to include it in the comments. We will get to your questions later on in the panel, and to really entertain some of the broader questions that you have across. And I see some people joining us from across the country, so make sure to do so. So Basima, let me return to you in terms of what we always say at the university: method. What was the methods? What was the process of both putting the survey together and approaching it? Since again, you're going to be asked the question, so what was your method, and can you inform us about it?
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Bazian. And again, thank you to everyone joining us. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm happy to provide an overview of our survey process and methods. So the survey ran from October 14, 2020 to November 2nd, 2020, which was almost a total of 3 weeks. It was a national survey, so it was disseminated to all 50 US states. We had 1,800 respondents participate in the survey, but due to the criteria, we had 1,123 US Muslims who met the full criteria to have their data or to have their responses collected and analyzed in our final data findings and analysis. And so the criteria to participate was, for one, they had to consent to the consent form that we provided in the survey. They had to be Muslim. They had to be citizens or non-citizen residents living and or working in the US, but we did not specify, or the requirement wasn't for people to actually be citizens, and we didn't ask about citizenship status. And participants had to be age 18 or older. And as Sadiq mentioned, the intention and goal of the study was to understand the prevalence of Islamophobia in the United States and how it impacts Muslim individuals and communities. And it was really key for us to understand the perspectives of Muslim Americans, the perspectives, perception, and experience of the impacts of Islamophobia on Muslim Americans. And so that was key in our intent behind only wanting to survey Muslims. And in addition, we also wanted the survey findings to touch upon and account for the diversity of US Muslims and to assess their societal engagement and worldviews and belonging. In terms of the survey design, to assess the viability of the study and to obtain diverse insight and perspectives and to gather relevant concerns and questions surrounding the impacts of Islamophobia on US Muslims, we had scheduled several in-person focus groups with Muslim parents, Muslim professionals, and Muslim students. But unfortunately, due to COVID, we were only able to hold one in-person focus group with Muslim female students. And the focus group participants and their feedback, as well as the feedback that we received from external reviewers, was incredibly important and insightful and useful in terms of us crafting the questions and framing for the survey. In terms of the survey instrument and how it was actually disseminated, it was designed through Qualtrics, designed and disseminated through Qualtrics, which is a web-based platform to create and conduct online surveys. And as I mentioned, respondents had to consent to participate in the survey. It was limited to only participants who identified as Muslims. And one thing to add on that note is that beyond asking if respondents identified as Muslim, we didn't have any additional questions or safeguards posed to participants to ensure that those responding were actually Muslim. And the reason being that, well, we would hope and extend the expectation and hope that individuals who participated responded honestly in identifying as Muslim. But in reality, we were limited in terms of our ability to ethically and reasonably screen and assess individuals participating in the survey to ensure that they were Muslim. So we acknowledge that we cannot guarantee that all survey respondents were Muslim, but again, we want to extend the hope and the expectation that those who participated responded honestly. And in regards to our dissemination strategy, again, it was disseminated through Qualtrics and through email. And we used social media platforms such as Facebook and Twitter, as well as the networks of individuals and organizations that supported and collaborated on the project to help us with outreach and to disseminate the survey. And participants were able to reshare the survey on social media platforms or email. And it was essential that the survey be disseminated through as many different platforms and channels as possible, whether that was through our partner organizations or networks or individuals, in order to avoid selection bias and to accurately represent the diverse Muslim American population in our data collection and finding. So it was extremely important that we casted a really wide net in terms of who was able to participate in the survey. In addition to our partner networks and individuals who supported with outreach and dissemination, we developed a robust national database to connect and disseminate the survey to Muslim individuals, Muslim serving organizations, institutions, and mosques across the entire US. And we also use social media posts and ads to expand outreach and to, again, avoid selection bias in order to connect with Muslims more at random. And the survey was completely conducted online. Again, due to COVID, there were some limitations, and much of our work preparing for the survey and then disseminating or connecting with individuals had to be done virtually. And our national outreach efforts targeted Muslim community organizations, mosques, civil rights and advocacy organizations, higher education Muslim student groups, Muslim academics, Muslim elected officials, and research and policy institutions that address social justice issues and issues impacting US Muslims. So again, really wanting to cast a wide net to have the diversity of Muslims reflected in our survey findings. And yeah, the survey outreach and dissemination, again, was not selective and was intended to engage as many US Muslims as possible.
Right. I know how difficult it is to reach to 1,123 respondents, and you actually had more, but some did not fulfill the criteria. So it's really very impressive. Maybe you could just go into a little bit into some of the findings. So maybe we'll begin with you, As-Sadiq. What stood out and really shocked you in terms of findings? And really looked at some of the findings that really stood out. So for you, what was really findings of issues of concerns, things that really needs our immediate attention broadly?
Yeah, sure. There is several of troubling findings that stand out for us or surprise us as we examine the survey results. So let me walk you through the major one. Even though we know that Islamophobia existed in the US because of work done by people like yourself, Professor Bazian, and others, but the consensus of US Muslims that we survey about such reality was astonishing. So regardless of age, gender, or place of birth, nearly all participants believe that Islamophobia exists in the United States, with almost close to 98%. But also 95% of the participants agree that Islamophobia is a problem in the United States. Also, there is more than 7 out of 10 participants believe that women are more at risk of experiencing Islamophobia. And significantly, more than 8 out of 10 men than women survey participants believe Muslim women are at a greater risk of experiencing Islamophobia.
Maybe, Sadiq, maybe I could add in here that this almost is a universal phenomenon. It's the same type of data we see in France, in Canada, in our colleagues in New Zealand. So this is almost mirror across different regions.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that will beg the question whether the Muslim visibility and Muslimness in Western society is a problem. And we could infer from that is almost across the board, as you suggested, that because the visibility of Muslim women that subjugate them, and also the patriarchal notion of who the attackers are as well, it will tell us that. Also, almost 7 out of 10 participants have personally experienced Islamophobia in their lifetimes. This is also very significant. Among them, 76% responded that they experienced Islamophobia in the last 12 months. By the last 12 months, we meant October 2019 to October 2020. So again, that's coincide with the political climate at the time. So if you could imagine 76% of the surveyed folks experience Islamophobia one way or another. And also, regardless of age, gender, or place of birth, more than 6 out of 10 participants responded that they themselves or family member, friends, or members of their community have been affected by federal and or state policies that discriminate against Muslims. In addition, more than half of the respondents have been treated unfairly by a law enforcement officer because of their religious identity. And again, here I want to just highlight that it's not only just an act of individual that attacking Muslims or subjugating Muslims to Islamophobic tropes, but also the state itself, how the state facilitated the way in which Muslim to be viewed or others or viewed suspiciously or scrutinized or being surveilled most of their lifetime, as I suggested. But despite all this, only 12%, 12 out of 100 people of the participants have reported any Islamophobic incidents to the authority. And that's again will bug the question why people, when they encounter such incidents, why they don't report. And from the sub-question we notice that they respond either they didn't know even if they can report such incidents or where to report those incidents. So this might be a good window for going forward for us working within civil society, whether academia or otherwise, or policymakers, to really think about what we can do with this information. Mm-hmm. Also, 3 out of 10 survey participants have hide, and this is really sad, or try to hide their religious identity at some point in their lives. but participants between the age of 18 and 29 were more likely than any other group to have tried to hide their religious identity. And one of the most troubling findings is how the majority of US Muslims censor themselves. This is also another sad reality, that the survey found that regardless of age, more than 8 out of 10 of the respondents censor their speech or action out of fear of how people might respond or react to them. But more significantly, 9 out of 10 women censor themselves. That's also another sad reality. In addition, survey participants aged 18 and 29 were more likely to censor themselves than other groups. So also, when we are assessing the psychological and emotional impact of Islamophobia, most survey participants responded that Islamophobia actually affecting their emotional and mental well-being. And that's another striking reality as well. Also, almost 8 out of 10 participants said that Islamophobia preventing them from building social connection with non-Muslims. And almost 7 out of 10 of the respondents find it very difficult to build community with other US Muslims because of Islamophobia. And this is another reality that we encounter even anecdotally, that most people will say that I would love to get along with other Muslim community, but I'm not quite sure because of, how Muslims space has been surveilled, and we don't know who is there. Are they are Muslim or they are infiltrated individuals that they might get me in trouble. And lastly, I will say this: 7 out of 10 survey participants, they feel uncomfortable making demand on their local authority or congressperson. This is also another reality, that despite all the attempt of Muslim American to, some of us to participate in civically engaged with our society, but Islamophobia makes those people really reluctant to make any demand in their local authority or congressperson. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we could shift to Basim. Are there any positive findings from the survey? We could, not to say half full, half empty, but where are some of the things that we could actually say that there are some positive outcomes in this survey?
Yes, thankfully we have some positive outcomes from the survey to share out with everyone. Thank you, Sadiq, for providing an overview of those findings. And yeah, I'm happy to provide an overview of some of the major positive findings that we were able to collect through our survey, through the responses that we gathered. And I'll add, or sort of premise, that most positive and uplifting findings were in the assessment of the societal engagement of US Muslims, as well as US Muslims' worldviews and belonging. And this is despite a general climate of hostility in the United States. And what the survey is showing, or what the findings show, is that Muslims have a strong desire to belong. They have a strong desire for their children to have a sense of belonging and to feel part of US society, and that they have a place here. And that Muslims believe and have strong beliefs and ideals toward pluralism and equity. So those are just sort of the general theme in terms of like positive findings that we were able to gather. Speaking to diversity, almost all Muslims, 99.1%, irrespective of age, agree that it is a good thing that the US is made up of people from different cultures. So this speaks to Muslim Americans, believing that the US is diverse and supporting that diversity, and the different cultures and backgrounds and people that come here, that this is a good thing. And in considering racial prejudice, most survey participants, 97.1%, agree that racial prejudice is a major problem in the US. And of those, 83% strongly agree that it's a major problem in the United States. Also an important point to uplift here. In terms of racial equity, almost all survey participants, we're talking 99%, agree that all races and ethnicities of people should be treated equally. also an incredibly important finding. And some of these findings, I think, go to demystify sort of the ideas that people might have of Muslims in terms of Muslims' worldviews, or takes on race, racial equity, diversity. So this kind of goes to maybe dismantle some of those beliefs and to paint a more accurate picture of the actual beliefs, worldviews that Muslim Americans have. In terms of intercultural mixing, almost 3/4 of survey participants, 72.9%, agree that relations between Muslims and non-Muslims in the US are friendly. In terms of moving on to identity and sense of belonging, more than half of US Muslims identify themselves in everyday encounters as Muslim American. And I think this is important because, again, it goes to speak to the sense of belonging that Muslim Americans feel and have in being in the United States. And that it's important for them. They feel American and that they belong in this country and are part of the culture, society, the fabric that makes up the United States. In terms of healthcare, this was an interesting finding. Most survey participants, 97.5%, feel that they are treated fairly by healthcare providers when seeking medical attention. And I think that's something important to pin for healthcare and medical providers in caring for Muslim patients. So that was a nice finding there. In considering Muslims' ability to navigate and access public spaces, nearly all survey participants, 97.9%, feel that they can safely access community or social public spaces. And tagging on to that, nearly all women, 98%, and men, 97.7%, feel that they can safely access social public spaces. And this is important because it's obviously incredibly important that Muslims should feel comfortable accessing public spaces. And it's good that it's being reflected that they feel that they can do that and they can exist in these spaces and not have fear or be worried of harm or any kind of repercussions around that. 7 out of 10, 72.9% of participants agree that relations between Muslims and non-Muslims in the US are friendly. And the final finding that I'll share with you is most respondents, 93.7%, agree that it is important that to them that their children are or would be fully accepted as Americans. Again, tying back to that sense of identity and belonging and belonging in US society.
Great. Thank you. Now, assume that the full survey will be available on Othering and Belonging Institute website. So I do encourage our audience to download it, to share it, and to amplify both the positive findings as well as the challenges that we face in relations to the Muslim American experience. Now, I'm going to shift and actually introduce 3 other panelists that will take us into a conversation about the findings, and then also later on we'll bring both Sadaq and Basima back to the conversation. So thank you for really giving us the survey and introducing us to the findings. And now I'll shift and bring first Sumaya Waheed, Senior Policy Counsel with Muslim Advocates and policy experts for 15 years. But also she received her JD from UC Berkeley School of Law. So welcome. We'll celebrate another alumni joining us in this conversation. Second, I'll bring forth Dr. Maha Hilal. Maha Hilal is a researcher, writer on institutionalized Islamophobia. And I'd like to congratulate Maha for her book. I haven't read it, so I just congratulate you on Innocent Until Proven Muslim, Islamophobia, the War on Terror, and the Muslim Experience Since 9/11. Maha also is the co-director of Justice for Muslims Collective. Welcome and thank you for joining us. And then my third panelist coming in is Edward Ahmed Mitchell. Is a civil rights attorney who serves as the deputy director of the National Council on American Islamic Relations. I met Edward first in Georgia, so definitely the shift to the national scene is welcome and look forward to continue to working with you. So welcome, our 3 panelists. So first, let me begin with Sumaya. It's good to have you with us. Maybe you could actually take us through the general scene of legislation and policy relative to anti-Muslim hate, Islamophobia. how does the landscape of the legal what you call setup examines and approaches the Muslim subject as it relates to policy and law?
Yes, thank you, Hatem. And I want to thank the Othering and Belonging Institute for having me and for doing this research, because this data is really important when we talk to policymakers to have that evidence base for some of the changes that we seek. So I wanted to actually take a step back and acknowledge that anti-Muslim hate doesn't happen in a vacuum, that it happens within the context of American history, which is a history of settler colonialism, of genocide, and race-based slavery. And that the first American Muslims were in fact enslaved Africans, stolen from the continent of Africa. Around 20% of them are estimated to have been Muslim and were not permitted to practice their faith. And so lost all but a hint of the faith until about the 1900s. And then that is when you see the Black Muslim community starting to grow again, but then also experiencing government surveillance, being targeted, and seen as an anti-American threat. So Islamophobia is nothing new. It's been around, but what happened in 9/11 was that it was amplified and I think made extremely pervasive. And so to answer Dr. Bazian's question, or start to at least, it's a pretty extensive question. So I'll just take a couple of pieces as examples. As we all know, the Patriot Act was passed in the aftermath of 9/11, and it greatly expanded surveillance of our communities. And then what we also saw was an expansion of the executive branch's powers. So the president and federal law enforcement expanded their powers in many ways, citing national security. And we saw national security becoming a huge exception to constitutional protections and civil liberties. And so some of the ways that happened that are germane to this talk are racial and religious profiling. So federal law enforcement, the Department of Homeland Security, which was created again in the aftermath of 9/11, to focus on terror and target Muslim populations, and then the Transportation Security Administration, which is pretty notorious for its treatment of Muslims. Both of these and other agencies becoming like enshrining Islamophobia as a practice of targeting Muslims for our religious expression, categorizing our religious practice as inherently a threat, and even when, and this is through administrations. So, in the past 20 years, we've had Republican and Democrat administrations. Under the Obama administration, when they banned religious and racial profiling in federal law enforcement, they maintained the exception for the border and for national security. So we are still fighting to change that. And that's one of the legacies, just one piece of the legacies of 9/11. And so just to draw the point out, that's basically the government telling us, we don't trust you, and your civil liberties aren't important because, we don't trust you. So that remains in existence today. And I thought that was the finding that was mentioned before in the comments about nearly all Muslims have engaged in some form of self-censorship. I just want to take a moment and let that sink in, because when you engage in self-censorship, you're basically doing the work of the government for it, right? There's no lawsuit that you can pursue to stop self-censorship, and that's a pervasive effect of what we're experiencing from federal law enforcement or local law enforcement, because there's been a lot of cooperation as well with local and state law enforcement to target our communities. And so that curtailment of individual and collective freedom really mirrors the ways in which law enforcement and the FBI have targeted our religious practices. And so that was pretty disheartening to see. And I think that a lot of marginalized communities experience this in some way. But we can actually point to current FBI training protocols, for example, that problematize our religious expression, criminalize it, and then target us because of that. So, for Muslim advocates, that's just our continuing work to undo some of those harms that are enshrined in our policies and practices and laws today.
Thank you. Again, the fact that almost 90% or 9 out of 10 women, as well as 8 out of 10 men, don't censor themselves, and then 88% don't report, points to really a barrier of fear. And maybe we could turn to Maha, since we often focus on the media as the site of Islamophobia or public discourse, but really we're dealing with state apparatus, the government, that both uses the instruments of its power to undertake violence, structured violence toward the Muslim community in a variety of ways, including surveillance, sending individuals to crawl in the mosque. So how do you situate in your work and in this survey the role of the state in really approaching the Muslim community?
So thank you, Dr. Bazian, for the question, and thank you to the Othering and Belonging Institute for having me here today, as well as my amazing co-panelists. So to me, what this event is really about is putting into context, right, the survey results and thinking about what context would lead to the responses that were given by participants, whether it was about not reporting Islamophobic incidents to law enforcement, right? Whether it's about not wanting to or fearing some sort of association with other US Muslims. And to me, the starting point for this in the current context, when we talk about post 9/11, right, is the concerted government effort to demonize and target Muslims, right, vis-a-vis the war on terror that started almost immediately after 9/11, specifically in a speech that President Bush gave on September 20th of 2001. And, you know, even though Bush and other administrations have repeatedly stated that the target of the war on terror is not sort of the average Muslim or sort of the good Muslim, right? In practice, Muslims have been targeted both domestically and abroad. And the war on terror, notably, right, is not just a domestic apparatus. The war on terror is a global apparatus. And while we're often forced as Muslims to sort of see what's happening on the global level or the international level as separate from what's happening on the domestic level, they're very intertwined. And when we see sort of these very visible manifestations of US militarism and warfare abroad, undoubtedly the policies as well as the narratives and images coming out of US operations abroad impact what happens in the United States and how Muslims are being treated. So the war on terror obviously has numerous impacts, among them state violence. State violence is the driving force of the war on terror, but there's also hate violence and interpersonal violence. And when we think about the ways in which the state models the targeting of Muslims, namely that they can be targeted without recourse, without accountability, society then responds in turn to that message that it is similarly okay to target Muslims and that there will be no consequences of the targeting of Muslims. And we can think about this sort of even more broadly, right? What is the purpose of targeting Muslims? You know, in the framework of the war on terror, it has been sort of narrated as acts of vengeance, right? This is about restoring our image in the world. This is about, you know, why is it or how could it be that the United States was targeted, right? So oftentimes when we look at the ways Muslims have been targeted, it's also about humiliation. It's about how do we humiliate Muslims both domestically and abroad? And then what does that humiliation mean, these public displays of humiliation, mean for Muslims, the average Muslim, right, who's observing and conceptualizing and thinking about what their place in society is? So a couple other points that I want to capture is one of the findings, again, around 7 of 10 Muslims, out of 10 Muslims in this survey, find it difficult to build with other US Muslims. And as Dr. Bezian said, this is a direct ramification of the fact that Muslims know that it's quite often the case that there will be some sort of surveillance in their spaces. In addition, from the research and work that I've done, we can also think about this through the lens of internalized Islamophobia, right? Namely, how the environment of external Islamophobia becomes internalized within Muslims themselves. So what do we start to believe and think about Muslims as a result of what the messages are consistently and repeatedly? And do we then want to associate with other Muslims at the risk of being targeted even more? Second, I think when we talk about some of the survey findings in this, right, one of the interesting results and unfortunate results is that Muslims are not reporting Islamophobic incidents. This makes me think back to the unfortunate murder of our 3 winners, right? Dia, Yusur, and Razan, who were murdered by their neighbor in 2015 in North Carolina, and whose death was repeatedly attributed to a parking dispute. So if you can't even go to law enforcement with significant evidence that this, in fact, was not motivated by a parking dispute, but rather was a direct consequence of institutionalized, structural, interpersonal Islamophobia, then what then is the point? And how do we address that consequence? And I think the last thing I'll say for the sake of moving on is just to think about, you know, the idea of the public sphere, which is addressed in the survey as well. And I think that that's really important because it's promising that Muslims can generally feel safe, right? And I think obviously we'd have to, you know, a next step could be also to break down the results and findings by different ethnic, linguistic, cultural groups within the Muslims captured in this survey, right? Because unfortunately, that will probably lead to even more depressing findings, especially for example, Black Muslims who are often doubly targeted. But that is to say that, you know, when we think about the public sphere, when I first read the survey, my initial thought was, when do public spaces become political spaces by virtue of a Muslim being in them, especially when they are experiencing prejudice and discrimination? And I think that's very important because when you're in those spaces, what could be a public space for one person who is not Muslim, who does not identify as Muslim, again, becomes a political space. And so how do we exist as Muslims if every space we're in, you know, we can't go to the grocery store without being harassed, right, or called some sort of name, right? Then the grocery store becomes a political space. So how do we begin to dismantle and get at the root of some of these issues that are surfacing in the everyday experiences of Muslims? And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for these comments and views. The internalized Islamophobia is definitely a major piece, which reminds me of double consciousness of W.D. Du Bois and how that shapes an individual's perspective. And then geography of inclusion and exclusion. We did another survey where asking the question, where do Muslims feel anxious in public space? And actually a larger segment of them feel anxious. So they might actually show up in public space, but they have an anxiety about it that also we need to delve in it. Maybe I'll go to Edward at this point. And CARE has been doing a lot of work on civil rights for a long period of time. I remember we partnered with CARE on a number of reports, including Legislating Fear and others, and then the annual data on Muslim civil rights. So maybe take us on how does civil rights for Muslims look today in America, and where do you see parts of the survey that are both promising, but also where do you see challenges in there in relations to Muslim civil rights?
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulullah. Thank you, Professor, and assalamu alaikum to all of you. I join Maha and Sumaya in thanking the Othering and Belonging Institute for conducting this important survey and hosting this event. It's an honor to be with you. As the professor noted, I was asked to discuss civil rights and civil liberties in America in the context of the survey. And I want to start by just laying out what I'm going to discuss. So inshallah, I want to highlight one particular aspect of the survey that addresses this issue. Then I want to talk about some of the factors that I think led to that survey result. And then I'd like to share some, not good news, but promising news, some progress we're making in addressing the problems that this survey highlighted, inshallah, to all of the above. So first, the part of the survey I want to highlight is the issue of Muslims reporting on whether or not discriminatory policies implemented by the state have impacted them. Now, anecdotally, we know that this happens, right? We know about racial profiling at the airport, the Muslim ban, and many other things. But we often think of these things as wrong just as a matter of principle. Whether or not they impacted a large number of the community or not, it's just wrong as a matter of principle. But what the survey showed is not only is it wrong as a matter of principle, not only does it impact people, it impacts a very large segment of the Muslim American community, a much larger segment than I honestly expected. So if you check out this part of the survey, it indicates that of those people who were questioned, 2/3, 62% said that they, their family members, their friends, or members of their community have been impacted by federal or state policies that discriminate against Muslims. That's 2/3 of the American Muslim community. Now, what's interesting about this is that on other questions, you'll see a difference between how US-born Muslims respond to questions versus quote-unquote foreign-born Muslims. On this question, there is no significant difference. 63% of US-born Muslims said yes to that question. 62% of foreign-born said yes. That to me is remarkable, and it shows that this is a real issue that impacts our entire community, regardless whether you're Black, Arab, white, born here, born overseas, that the fact that our government's policies, what our government is doing, reaches all of us and reaches our families. So what are some of the manifestations of this and some of the causes for this? So the survey highlights one of the things that I think happens at the local level to everyone. We are all at some point likely to interact, not necessarily with an FBI agent, but with a local police officer, right? We all at some point in our lives get pulled over, despite your excellent driving habits, I'm sure. And so what the survey indicated is that 53% of Muslims said they'd been treated unfairly by a law enforcement officer. Now, I didn't say what kind of officer that was, but I can bet you that that includes police officers, that includes immigration officers at the airport. Those are probably the two major examples of when people are interacting with government authorities, officers, and being treated differently because they are Muslim. That could be everything from secondary screening at the airport, being forced to turn over your cell phone when you're traveling, extra pat downs, those sort of things. And then when you're being pulled over by a police officer, of course, we've heard horror stories about the way Muslims have been treated on the side of the road. And of course, if you're Muslim and Black, then you're facing double risk. So what are some of the government policies, the structural things that exist that are leading to all this? So there are about 10 things I want to note here. So one, as already mentioned, is the Patriot Act. That's perhaps the most famous thing that all Americans are aware of, even if they don't know exactly what's in the Patriot Act. But essentially, it allowed the government to do so much more in terms of surveillance, spying, targeting individuals that they suspected posed a threat to our country, even without any evidence. The Patriot Act is still the law of the land. That's the bad news. The good news is that if you look at polls back in 2004, 2002, the Patriot Act had wide support in the United States. And in fact, criticizing it could have been the end of your political career. If you look 10 years later in 2015, evenly split, with a slight majority of American people saying the Patriot Act should be reformed. That still hasn't happened yet, but the first step towards that happening is changing hearts and minds in the public. That, alhamdulillah, has happen. The next thing I want to note is entrapment. This is something that I think impacts the community at a very wide level. Right now, CARE and the ACLU are going to the Supreme Court over a case in Los Angeles in which the FBI was sending in informants to target the community. And that is not unique. That happens all across the country. We estimate there are at least 10,000 FBI informants that have been established over the past 10 years that go into communities supposedly looking for plots. And if a plot cannot be found, we fear they are inventing plots and using people who are mentally ill, young, impressionable to make those cases. That is a huge problem that continues to persist under both Democratic and Republican administrations. The good news on that is that it's been exposed. It's being fought in court. As we said, we're going to SCOTUS right now. And though I don't expect the FBI to end that practice anytime soon, again, the first steps towards changing it is exposing it, fighting in court, and making sure the public is aware of why this is problematic. The other thing, another example is the NYPD spying program that went on for over 10 years. Alhamdulillah, that has completely come to an end. It did incredible damage to the Muslim community in New York, but that community persevered. They fought back, and it's over. That's the good news. The CVE program, alhamdulillah, the community, most of the Muslim community rallied against that program, spoke out against it, refused to participate in it. Some did, sadly, but most of us did not. And that program eventually failed. And now the government's trying to reinvent it with a new name, but it's still not getting any sort of significant support from the Muslim community. That's the good news. The terrorist watch list, the no-fly list, those things are still in existence. They're still causing problems for Muslims. But again, we're fighting it. Right now, CARE and others are in court fighting the watch list. We managed to subpoena government officials, interview them, interrogate them on the record about this watch list. We found out that not only has the government been spying on Muslims using this list, but they've been giving names on this list to employers and local government agencies, which could explain why Muslims experience some difficulties in terms of banking, housing, and other such things. Another issue, bulk data collection. This is something that Edward Snowden and others obviously exposed and was ruled unconstitutional and has been reformed, still happening, but been reformed and in some cases shut down. Anti-Sharia laws, for years you had local state governments passing these anti-foreign law bills. That has stopped. There are not really many of those that are still being passed. Some states have them and they have not activated them. They're not being used. And that's, again, thanks to the community speaking up, filing successful lawsuits, in particular in Oklahoma. And so that's the good news, that trend has stopped. The Muslim ban obviously was repealed. It took obviously 4 years and a lot of work, but it's done. So these are some of the things that have highlighted and emphasized and led to Muslims feeling targeted and Muslims being targeted. But the good news is we're fighting back against that. Some of these things have been changed, and the things that haven't been changed, we are continuing to fight them. So this survey is important because it shows these things are not just wrong in principle. They really do impact individual people. But alhamdulillah, I think it also shows that we can make progress against these sort of things.
Thank you, Edward. Being a person that experienced being Muslim while flying more often than I could recount, I could relate to the 10 items that you highlighted. Maybe we could actually bring back both Sadiq and Basima so we could have a conversation with everyone on the panel. And I really want to throw the questions because this survey, as well as other studies, the whole field of actually studying Muslims, documenting Muslims, and approaching Muslims as Muslims, rather than actually studying Muslims for other purposes. So often many of the studies, at least my critique post 9/11, really objectified the Muslims for studies that is not for the Muslims, but rather set against the Muslims, and the whole field of security studies and so on. So how do you view, and anyone can jump for this question, how to study Muslims as Muslims, methodologically, as well as the key issues and points? Anyone could jump on this question if you would like.
Let me kick us off. I think one of the ways we thought about it, at least I remember sitting in our office at UC Berkeley, Basim and I just glanced at the New York Times, and it says Muslim this. It was about securitization of Muslim bodies. So when I read and I tell her, look, they surveying 15 people, and this is what they come up and generalizing the subject matter. And that's what really energized our thinking about this survey. Like I stated earlier, the problem with studying Muslim, because Muslim always been the non-indigenous to this place, the foreigner, the coming taking over, the remnants of sleeping cells and all the likes, because it's so ingrained in the way in which the structure of this society, that the other non-dominant group is subjugated Muslim, and we became just like the imperial time. We send anthropologists to study those weird local people. So I think is a time of that is over. I think a lot of Muslims themselves, Americans, they are taking the lead. They are speaking out. They are asserting their position by creating, just like what we do, Basim and I, for example, in this, or all of you doing the same fantastic work, that we see our struggle in relation to other groups. It's not just us. We are not alone in this. But I think it's about time for us to step up the blade to work in designing our own voices, to study and to be in communication with our communities, to bring their voices, their concern out, and to work with our communities themselves. That way, the more we do this type of work, I think it will make us able to speak with certainty about the voices of the voiceless, of the one they try to be silent. So I think studying Muslims in America, and also within the confinement of the academia, because most of us are work or operate there, is how we can study Muslim and Islam, especially Muslims, beyond the idea of the just theology or part of this department or that department. It requires to study Muslims as also social groups, that they deserve its own department with all facets of knowledge that Muslims have and contribution and their resilience that they brought to the society.
Maybe I could follow. Have we maybe overcame what Mamadani, the good Muslim, bad Muslim, or Mustafa Bayomi's book, How Does It Feel to Be a Problem? Are we in a different space, or we're still in that space?
I would just note, so number one, to the first question, I wanted to briefly say that I think a real benefit of Muslims, polling Muslims and doing this work, is that we know what questions to ask. And also we can do a better job of trying to make sure we're reflecting the diversity of the community. One of the most difficult things when you do these surveys is to try to accurately get at the racial makeup of the American Muslim community, because no one really knows for sure what it looks like, but that really can make a huge difference in these surveys. When we did a survey recently, we ended up weighting it to show how the results will be different if you increase the number of African-American respondents to match their estimated population, and it really changes things. So I think Muslims are aware of that, and we probably make a real effort to address that, and so that's a benefit of us diving in. And then I would say that I think your survey indicates that for many Muslims, we're still not comfortable. We still don't feel accepted as Americans, and we still want to be accepted as Americans. I think that the poll indicated over 90% said it was important to them that their children feel fully accepted as Americans. And so I still think there is, for many people, that desire, not to be viewed as a bad Muslim, but I think we're in a much better place on that problem than we were 10 years ago. I think the community has matured in many ways beyond that. We're moving beyond condemning every bad thing that's done by a Muslim, and we've moved on to proactive things and just standing up for ourselves and saying what we believe in. So I think those are good things, but I still think we have a problem in the community insofar as we feel that we need to be accepted. I don't care if anyone accepts me as an American. I am an American. And whatever my neighbor thinks about that does not matter. And I don't even care if they like me as a Muslim. All I care about is they respect my rights. And so I think if we internalize that perspective, not an indifference, but a feeling of strength, that at the end of the day, my only job is to be able to ensure that I can live out my life and practice my faith. And that's all I need. If you like me, that's great. But at the least, I'm going to make sure you respect me. then I think we won't feel the need to please anyone at all, or to be a good Muslim or a bad Muslim or fit into those binaries.
Maybe to jump to another question, I do really want to dive into a little bit on the gendered aspect of Islamophobia. Again, the data from this survey, the data from the earlier surveys, France CCIF, points to the gender dimension of Islamophobia and how to understand it. And is it a matter because Muslim women with Islamic dress in public space are a visible target, or there's something else at work? So also women who are not wearing the headscarf likewise face Islamophobic incidents in the workplace. So we don't want to make it only in terms of that part. So how do we understand the gender dimension of Islamophobia? Sumaya or Maha, if you want to judge, not because I'm pointing you because we're women, I want to include you in the conversation. So just to make sure.
I'll start to take a stab and definitely welcome comments from the others. You know, I think there's a number of things going on. As I had mentioned before, Islamophobia doesn't happen in a vacuum. So gendered Islamophobia doesn't happen in a vacuum either. And we do live in a sexist and misogynistic society. And so that's definitely at play. And I think that in terms of when we're talking about Muslim women who are visibly, you know, either wearing a headscarf or in some other way targeted because of visibly being Muslim, for me, I see it as both being extra visible and then also what our dress might represent to other people. And I kind of harp on this, but the white feminist kind of construction of Muslim women as needing to be saved, and how that can lead to violence against women or assaults, because then they turn the blame on us for subscribing to a set of beliefs that they haven't asked us about, but they assume that we hold. So I think that can be at play as well. And yeah, I would welcome comments from the others. I thought that was an interesting piece of the survey and definitely worth delving into further.
One thing that I can add in relation to this is some of our work on anti-Sharia legislation. We've been documenting since 2017 anti-Sharia legislation and the anti-Sharia law movement in the United States. And one thing that's particularly interesting is this type of legislation is introduced to quote unquote protect Muslim women in some way from Sharia and the harms that it supposedly inflicts on women. But interestingly enough, some of our research has indicated that it does, I mean, in many ways it harms everybody, but it doubly impacts women in the sense that if there's a state, for example, Mississippi, that has enacted an anti-Sharia law or has passed that into legislation, one of the issues with that is that a woman, if in her marriage contract she seeks divorce from her husband, in the Islamic marriage contract, there is a stipulation in which, in the event of divorce, she might receive some financial support, some money in the case of divorce. And if the state has enacted an anti-Sharia law in that state, then that contract is essentially null and void and can't be looked to. And so she therefore isn't eligible, or she isn't able to access the money that was promised to her through her marriage contract. And so it therefore goes to harm Muslim women. In addition to the legislation being Islamophobic, it also goes to impact women at that level as well. So just wanted to tag that in terms of also contextualizing the impacts of Islamophobia and how it impacts Muslim at also the structural level, and outside of thinking about how women might be more easily targeted based on dress, it also expands to the structural level.
I guess I would add that, you know, along the lines of what Sumaya said, right, that there is this Western feminism desire and obsession to save Muslim women. Obviously, The war on Afghanistan has been an acute example of that, whether it was from the beginning in 2001 when Laura Bush specifically campaigned for the war in Afghanistan to save Muslim women, or whether it's now where Muslim women again are sort of problematized and used and weaponized to sort of legitimize a militaristic agenda. That said, I think, dress is one part of it. Muslim women who wear hijab are often visible reminders of the Muslim presence, right? And it's easier to recognize the sort of what you despise or what you hate when someone is cueing you to say that they are of this identity. And so there's just a lot of ways that, women are being impacted and targeted, and makes sense. And I think there's also another way that's I think has been quite neglected, and it's not necessarily the purview of the study, but when we look at the ways that state violence has impacted the Muslim community in general, with, for example, entrapments in federal terrorism prosecutions, detention, torture, that has disproportionately targeted men, Muslim men specifically. But what ends up happening is that Muslim women are left then to pick up the pieces and to sort of, take care of the family, to deal with often the Islamophobia resulting from the stigma of their loved ones, whether they're in prison, whatever it is. And so there's also that element of it. And I'm not sure that that was necessarily captured or incorporated into, the ways that we generally understand impacts on Muslim women and the reasons why we think that they're more of the targets. But I think that there is obviously multiple reasons for that. But I think prime among them being that there's a specific construction by the government and the media in terms of what Muslim women represent, and sort of being the embodiment of a threat. And at the same time, it's sort of nuanced imagery, right? Because we're a threat, but at the same time, we're helpless. And so there's a lot of navigating on what to do and how to act on those assumptions and tropes.
Right. I'm going to try to fuse few things together because we're coming close to in terms of our time. The survey shows that 98% say that Islamophobia is real, it exists, that's what they're expressing. Yet, almost 80 to 90%, give and take between men and women, don't report censoring themselves. And also 76 plus don't make demand on public policy circles. So you could see that there's a problem, but the problem is almost constructed not to be addressed. So if you were taking a lens of recommendation, what would you recommend to educators, to policymakers, to community leaders and organizations of how to tackle these seemingly serious problems that also has elements that actually prevents it from being addressed at the individual level in the community?
I will start us off. I think those are really very important findings, and one of the purpose of the survey is actually to lay out the ground of to highlight the challenges that we face as a communities, but also as a society. And I have to say that is there is multiple ways to do this, and one of them is, for example, I know Hatim Badian's center, they have an app, for example, that to just through your phone, you can report the incidents. I think to popularize our work in the communities among everybody, at least we can drive in data to force the national and local authority to look into that. But of course, that will never happen without forcing our way in terms of educating. But it should not fall into our own as Muslim communities to educate everybody. But how we can think about including Muslims' experience within the educational curriculum. And this goes to K-12 and onward. Because without the knowledge, our institute, one of the premises that we keep saying and touching upon, othering and belonging. If you don't reverse the mechanism of othering, belonging became an elusive idea. it will never materialize. And one of the ways in which to do that is actually to bridging. And bridging not required for me as a marginalized, invisible harm to give up anything. Is actually to create a bridge with other group like myself. Second, that the larger society structures, including education, health, housing, etc., and public policy, is to facilitate the way in which to create those bridges. So to answer your questions, I think raising social awareness, societal awareness about the problem is very important. Second, is really one of the elephant in the room that we didn't talk a lot about. It is like the media, the way in which media even signal, sometimes bypassing about the Muslimness of some part of our population, as if we always have to defend something. You know, it's really troubling. So many times when we engage in media interviews, I have to correct the reporter. Like, listen, I'm not going to do that, but I'm going to say this. So I think those type of work, and I don't want to take up so much time, but I think this type of work involves all of us in different fields that to rethink the way in which we position ourselves. And I really like what Edward said earlier, you know, this idea of creating laws to protect all of us, and we should stand for that. So if the indigenous people have to fight the Dakota pipelines, we should be there, all of us, because that's the only way we secure our clean water, maybe here in California or somewhere in Montana. It doesn't have to be just South Dakota.
I would note, Dr. Bazian, very quickly. So when I saw that poll result, that scared me. I mean, that was very concerning to me that many Muslims said they do not report Islamophobic incidents. But the one possible silver lining is that many Islamophobic incidents may not be reported because there's nothing to report. So, for example, if you're walking down the street and someone in a car drives by and says, "Go back to your country," you know, a Muslim person may say, "All right, well, I'm not going to call the police. The person's gone. I'm not going to call CARE. There's nothing they can do." So it may not be that the person's afraid to report, doesn't know. It may be that in some cases they feel like there's nothing that can be done. But to the extent there are other cases of people who are just, they're afraid to report it, they don't know where to report it, that's very concerning. And I think, as El Sadiq mentioned, education is key, that to the extent a significant number of people said they didn't even know where to go to report, you know, people have got to know about CARE and Muslim advocates and others. They can call Muslims to help point them in the right direction, help give them guidance, especially if it's discrimination in the workplace, something illegal, or a crime. Those things have to be reported, because if you don't, the next person is going to be a victim, and then someone after that, until someone stands up for themselves and says this is not okay. But I just want to note there is a possible silver lining in that result, that maybe it's not as bad as we think.
Or maybe another way is that the level of tolerance of victims of Islamophobia, that the rate of what they consider to be Islamophobia has almost went to only direct violence, and therefore everything beyond that is seen as normal. So a woman in the grocery store being assaulted verbally, which should not be acceptable, is being seen as just, we're in a time where open type of verbal hostilities is acceptable. So that's also a way to maybe nuance some of these findings. But I think delving deeper into the data will be very important, and maybe do a follow-up interviews with some of the respondents on those questions. Let me take a question. Go ahead.
Sorry, I would just also add that in some cases, what happens may be the stated policy of the agency. So if you think of the stops at the airport, who are you going to complain about TSA to? I think they do have a complaint line, but I don't know anyone who's ever gotten anything measurable from that, right? So if it's their stated policy that they can do a double, you know, a secondary screening on you, like you just accept that and don't feel like there's any point in complaining about it.
And I would
let me take a question directly, and then you could add to it from the audience. Sana, who's I think presented in our Islamophobia conference here at Berkeley a while back, she said, "I'm curious to know if there is a correlation between skin eye color and Islamophobia. Are darker skinned Muslims more at risk of experiencing Islamophobia in the United States?" So really speaking or discussing here the issue of race and skin tone as it relates to Islamophobia.
I think we can
Anyone
say,
feel free to jump.
so I think we can say yes, obviously, and especially when we're talking about the United States, which is at its core, right, anti-Black, and so there is the thread of anti-Blackness that runs throughout the entire history of this country, as in the entire colonial history of this country, and so, you know, when I've talked to Black Muslims myself for some of the research projects that I've worked on, they've often told me, you know, we feel like we're doubly targeted, or we don't know why we're targeted. Is it because we're Muslim, or is it because we're Black? So I think that that's definitely an issue. And I think we're also operating within a racial hierarchy in the United States, and that is very clear. And so whenever there's a system of oppression, of which there are many that are operating in the United States, it's sort of incumbent to sort of place it alongside or within to better understand who's going to be the most impacted by any given system of oppression, such as Islamophobia.
Anyone would like to add to this?
Yeah, just one. I 100% agree with what Maha says, and I think another issue that would like to point out to our communities as well is this idea that regardless of whether we would like to integrate or to feel belong to the American society, we have to understand what structure that we are yearning to belong to. The structure that is really based on racial hierarchy, white supremacist, structure that negate and try to invisibilize the weak and the marginalized even further. So understanding the structural racialization of this country is really very important for our work, because Islamophobia is not uniquely just to, we are the first people we've been subjugated to. We have to remember the Chinese Exclusionary Act. We have to remember the Japanese entrapment, and before that, the genocide against Native American and enslavement of African people. So when you put all this together, Islamophobia, it comes into a time that is just our time. So in order even to fight it back, we need to understand in which context that existed. And when we know that, that will help us to fight it in more effective ways. So I think I definitely agree as a Black Muslim male that I oftentimes don't know exactly which one is you coming at me because of my Muslim name or my feature or because I'm a Black male. So all that combined, and I will add, imagine if I'm a Muslim Black woman wearing hijab. That will be triple times. So I think race and gender play very important role of our understanding, and that should inform our way in which we combat Islamophobia, but also our solidarity with the most marginalized group. And we have to remember that we cannot also yearn to belong to structural racialization notion of American society. We have to yearn for all of us to belong. And when we do that work, I think Islamophobia could be issue of the past.
There was an earlier question that posed, and I think maybe if we have some information, has there been any survey or research done on Islamophobia focusing on students, whether it's college or K through 12? Do we have such material that we could direct some of our audience to?
Oh yeah, there have been a lot of surveys, especially on K through 12. So ISPU has done this work. CARE California has, I think, almost an annual survey they do about school bullying. So those are two resources you might want to check. ISPU, whatever they've done on school bullying, and also CARE California. A lot of data about what students have experienced, and it's as bad as you would expect.
Yeah, I'm aware of the CARE California that did, which bullying as it relates to religious identity. And as far as I remember the data, 55% of Muslim K through 12 age kids experience bullying for their religious identity. So these are important materials and information to share. And I know ISPU partnered with MSA West, Muslim Student Association of the West, to actually look at the university setting. And I think the research came out last year, if I'm not mistaken. Huzaifa asked the question, what kind of work needs to happen from the bottom up for society to understand the severe impacts of institutionalized Islamophobia and to feel a sense of responsibility to take action? So this is to anyone. He shared it on Facebook, but also on our comments line. What kind of works need? Maybe we could just say what type of work, what type of research, what type of projects, programs that can be taken from the bottom up at the grassroots level.
Well, I would just say when Muslims are engaged in politics, either as people running for office or people engaging with candidates, that especially at the federal level with people running for Congress, this needs to be a key issue you're presenting, not just the typical things like the Muslim ban we were raising, but these nitty gritty things like watch lists, no-fly lists, and other things that people may not know a lot about, but do represent institutionalized Islamophobia, racial profiling, religious profiling at the border. Candidates should be making commitments to address these issues when they are in Congress, and especially if they're running for president or any other federal office. So I do think that it's a priority that we should be making when we're engaging in politics. And that can help because at the end of the day, people can know all about these things, and that's important, but it's going to take legislative or regulatory change to impact them.
Great. We're coming to the end of our program, so I'm going to give each one of you just a minute to wrap up. Just how do you see or assess the survey, and what other works that we need to do? So we'll begin from Maha. I see you on top of my screen, so go ahead.
So I think one of the first thing is that these perspectives are grounded in reality. It might be easy to dismiss for those who want to dismiss that there are reasons why there's a context in which Muslims exist that has produced the results of the survey, as it were. Second, I think just trying to assess and position ourselves as Muslims within the current historical, social, political context. And I think, the one thing that I will say is, although there are some aspects of the survey that are very, not as bleak, I do think it's important to think about what we need to do to advocate for ourselves. And part of that is, when we're thinking about policy and legal changes, right? A lot of what has been discussed, if, for example, a policy is appealed, like the Muslim ban, that is simply a restoration of rights. It's not a proactive gain of rights. And so I think that has to be in context in terms of thinking about how far we've come and how much more work we have to do.
Thank you. And Basima?
Hi, thank you. Just extending a big thanks and gratitude to everyone for joining, and for the co-panelists for speaking, and Dr. Bazian for moderating the conversation. In terms of next steps, kind of piggybacking off of what Maha said, I think there's a lot to be done. And one thing that popped into mind just thinking about that is, I know Edward mentioned that the anti-Sharia legislation has kind of come to a halt, and in a lot of ways it has slowed down significantly. Last year in 2020, there were only 3 bills introduced compared to years prior, in which 10 plus bills were introduced over the several years period. But an issue stands in that there's 231 anti-Sharia bills or anti-Sharia legislation that have been introduced at the state level. And I think that in some of those have been enacted into law. 20 bills have been enacted into law. And so in part, and I think in one way, not only is it anti-Sharia legislation, but these other federal measures that have been brought into the conversation, these need to be dismantled. And there's a lot of work to be done to address that, because ultimately that trickles down from the federal level or state level into our communities and greatly impacts us, as we've engaged in the conversation today around. I think one thing that Sadiq shared and brought to the floor was thinking about a curriculum around addressing Islamophobia, a K through 12 curriculum, and understanding the difficulties in implementing something like that, but just how important it is to be engaging these conversations at that level with children and young people, and really kind of baking that into the American fabric. So those are just some thoughts that I have.
And Edward?
So, again, I think we talked about the issue of making sure that Muslims can and are reporting Islamophobic incidents. So I think we need to make a big concerted effort to continue educating our community about the options they have to report employment discrimination, which is a huge issue that so many people face, and also government discrimination and hate crimes and hate speech. So I think we need to educate people, and not just in the mosques. It's great to have a Know Your Rights presentation in a mosque. That's important, but to even go beyond the mosque to try to reach Muslims and educate them about their rights so they can defend their rights. And the last thing I would note is that just as a philosophical matter, in our fight to be quote unquote accepted and get our rights, we can't sacrifice our faith. It's so tempting to hide our religion, which many of us have done. It's so tempted not to stand up for our rights, not to get involved in politics. And I think most of us are resisting that. And so I think we just have to keep in mind that we will never win our rights by giving up our faith, by giving up our values. We've got to hold on tight to those. And regardless of what anyone thinks, it will be okay in the end, God willing. And so just stand up for yourself, fight for your rights, but don't give up you in the process.
And Sumaya?
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate those comments, and I echo them, and would just reiterate that, given the discomfort that people might feel in demanding change, that it's on us to really help people fight through that, to continue to engage with our communities so that people are making demands on our elected officials who work for us. And I really appreciate Edward talking about really holding elected officials to task for how they will stand up for our communities. And I think that can also trickle down to the local level, particularly with hate speech and disrupting hate speech in a safe way. And that also needs to move online as well. So there's plenty of work to do. I think this survey helps us direct some of our attention to where we need, and really appreciate the conversation.
Thank you. And Sadiq, you get the last word.
Thank you. And I don't want to hold people beyond 1:30, but I think a couple of items that stand out for me that is the next level is really we have to strengthen our solidarity. Yes, we using our community and organizing power. If we do that, I think we will be able to do many of the above, is to be in solidarity with other marginalized people, to educate the others. And that will give us a pride and sense of belonging who we are without jeopardizing anything. And also we need to work in cross-sectoral coalition.
Thank you. Let me thank everyone. First, let me thank Mark, who actually is in the background making all of us look good and switching through and managing the presentation. Thank you, Mark, for your work, for making this a smooth panel. I'll thank all of our audience, some friends that we know, some colleagues from across the country that joined this important conversation. Thank the panelists, Sadiq, Basima, Edward, Maha, and Sumaya. For Maha, I encourage people to pick the book, Innocent Until Proven Muslim. Is very important to support materials and books that are written from within the community. The narrative is so important, so I encourage people to pick the book, to access it, and to share it with others. I'd like to thank Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley for the great work that is being undertaken on Islamophobia and their partnership with the Islamophobia Studies Center. We've been really blessed with a list of co-sponsors: Islamophobia Research and Documentation Project, Center for Race and Gender, CARE, Justice for Muslims Collective, Muslim Advocates, and ISBU. You enriched us, you blessed us for your presence. The work continues, and may we see each other on the long struggle for justice. Assalamu alaikum, and see you in the near future.